This is the Sleepless Historian, weaving history's whispers for restless nights. Join our journey at Historica, share the calm, subscribe, and drift deeper into the past. One of the last great kings of the Neo-Assyrian Empire was Ashurbanipal, who ruled from 668 to around 630 BCE. If you were to judge him only from the relief sculptures on the walls of his palace, you'd see that he was a militaristic king who was preoccupied with battles, and who filled his leisure hours by killing lions from a chariot. But he had another side as well. Unlike most Mesopotamian kings, Ashurbanipal was an intellectual, a man who could read and write, and who studied with the scholars at his court. He collected vast numbers of literary and religious works, and organized them in a number of rooms in his palace at Nineveh, in the northern part of modern-day Iraq. This collection is considered to be one of the earliest libraries ever created. Since the documents were written on clay tablets, they survived for more than 2,500 years. When the library was rediscovered during the mid-19th century excavations, these same writings provided modern scholars with an extraordinary window into the intellectual world of the Neo-Assyrians. Ashurbanipal had included in his library a copy of a poem known as the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's considered to be a masterpiece of literature and the world's oldest epic poem. It was already more than 500 years old when Ashurbanipal's scribes wrote out the copy for his library. I'll come back to that in a moment. First, let's look at Ashurbanipal's library in more detail. Why was he so interested in the written word? It might have had something to do with his wife, Labali-Sharat. We have a letter that was written to Labali-Sharat before her husband became king, and though she might have found the letter annoying, it's fascinating for us. In it, her sister-in-law wrote, "Word of the king's daughter to Labali-Sharat, why don't you write your tablet and do your homework?" Here, one princess was scolding another for not writing her tablets and not doing her homework. This implies that it was expected that the royal princess would be literate. Yet it's a surprise, because we don't have a lot of evidence for literate women in Mesopotamian history. The fact that Labali-Sharat could read and write might suggest that she had some influence on her husband, or perhaps he had influence over her. Either way, they were a literate royal couple, a very unusual thing. After his father died and Ashurbanipal became king in 668 BCE, he bragged about his wisdom. He wrote about all the types of study he had undertaken. "I learned the hidden secret, the whole of the scribal craft. I can discern celestial and terrestrial portents, and deliberate in the assembly of the experts." He's saying that he could understand signs that were believed to come from the gods. He continued, "I am able to discuss the series, if the liver is a mirror image of the sky, with capable scholars." This was a scholarly text that listed liver omens and their interpretations, which he could analyze. Next, he said, "I can solve convoluted reciprocals and calculations that do not come out evenly." So he was trained in complicated mathematics. And I have read cunningly written text in Sumerian, the interpretation of which is difficult. Sumerian was an ancient and dead language already by this time, but Ashurbanipal had studied and learned how to make sense of it. Finally, he said, "I have examined stone inscriptions from before the flood, which are sealed, stopped up, mixed up." The documents he had read were so ancient that he believed that they had been written before the mythical flood. This would be like someone today being able to read medieval manuscripts. It would have taken a lot of time and effort to learn. All of this tells us that Ashurbanipal was deeply interested in scholarly learning, and as a result, he was singularly focused on the creation of his library. Now, it wasn't what we think of as a library. People couldn't come in and borrow cuneiform tablets to read and study. Instead, it was a collection of written works for the king's use and for his court. Yet it didn't include much of what you would expect in a library, like works about history or current events or scientific discoveries. Still, the shelves of Ashurbanipal's library were aligned with tablets representing the most advanced knowledge of the time. knowledge useful to the king. There were tablets with long lists of words used by scribes in school, and there were copies of royal inscriptions from the past. There were rituals and hymns, some of them in the dead language of Sumerian. There were texts describing medical conditions and the ways to treat them. And there were thousands of omen texts which listed a particular unusual event or sign and explained what was supposedly going to happen as a result of that sign. Only a few of the texts were what we would recognize as literary, stories about heroes and gods. The discovery of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh in the 1850s created front-page headlines once its contents began to be revealed. The two archaeologists who excavated there were Hormuzd Rassam and Austin Henry Laird. Rassam was born in Iraq and educated at Oxford. He later became the British Museum's Director of Mesopotamian Excavations, and Laird was a British lawyer, archaeologist, and diplomat. Nineveh was of great interest in the new field of archaeology because it had been the fourth and largest capital of Assyria. The religious capital of Ashur was the first. Then Ashurnazirpal II had moved the capital to Kalhu. Later, a king named Sargon built a big new capital city that he modestly called Fort Sargon after himself. Around 700 BCE, Sargon's son moved the capital, this time to Nineveh, which is where it stayed for the rest of the Neo-Assyrian Empire until 612 BCE. The British excavator, Laird, described the discovery of the library this way. He wrote, "To the height of a foot or more from the floor, the rooms were entirely filled with cuneiform documents, some entire, but the greater part broken into many fragments." Unfortunately, the archaeologists Rassam and Laird didn't really know what to do with so many cuneiform tablets. It was the first time that a really large collection of tablets had been uncovered, and the archaeologists didn't think to make notes of which ones were found in each location. So they put the tablets in boxes and shipped them back to the British Museum. In the process, the library tablets got mixed up with others that had been found in the palaces at Nineveh. Ever since, scholars have been trying to sort out the confusion, and it's very difficult. If the library had been excavated more recently, we'd have photographs of exactly where each fragment had been located when recovered, and we could see how the tablets had been originally organized. It does seem, though, that the library was spread across 4 different buildings on the citadel, 2 palaces and 2 temples. Once the tablets arrived in the British Museum, scholars set out to work on them, like a jigsaw puzzle, finding broken fragments that fit together and reconstructing the tablets. This continues. They also began to translate them. Cuneiform had only recently been deciphered, and there was a lot of interest in what was written on these tablets. There still is. One man who made a big contribution to this effort was a British Assyriologist named George Smith. He hadn't formally studied cuneiform or the Akkadian language. Actually, he didn't attend university at all. He was from a working-class family, and he left school young to become a banknote engraver. But he was a brilliant individual who was fascinated by cuneiform and taught himself how to read it. The British Museum brought him in to help work on the library tablets. In December 1872, about 20 years after Ashurbanipal's library was rediscovered, George Smith addressed the Society of Biblical Archaeology at the British Museum. He had astounding news. While working on mythological texts from Nineveh, he'd found 80 fragments from a single long poem written on 11 tablets. On tablet number 11, he discovered an account of a flood that was almost identical to the one in the Bible. A man was chosen by a god to survive a flood that wiped out almost all life. He was given instructions to build a boat and to load animals onto it. The floodwaters rose and the storm raged, but eventually the boat landed on a mountaintop. The man and his family survived, and they thanked the gods for their deliverance. This man's name was Utnapishtim, and the god who warned him about the flood was named Ea. But the similarities to the biblical story of Noah astounded everyone listening to Smith's talk. Newspapers around the world covered the story, and it was a great topic of conversation. Some people thought the Assyrian version confirmed the truth of the biblical tale. Others thought it raised more doubts. One London newspaper, The Telegraph, even decided to send Smith to Nineveh to search for more fragments of the flood story. Amazingly, he found them. I don't know of any other instance when an archaeologist wanted to find a particular piece of a text at a site and was able to do so. Think about it. 30,000 tablets and tablet fragments had been discovered at Nineveh during Laird's excavations, and only a handful of them came from the flood story. So the fact that Smith's later excavation recovered additional fragments of the flood tablet is almost unbelievable, but it's true. In Smith's book about this project, he notes that he started excavating at the palace on May 9th, and just 5 days later, his workmen uncovered what he was looking for. He wrote, "On cleaning one of the tablets, I found to my surprise and gratification that it contained the greater portion of 17 lines of the inscription, and fitting into the only place where there was a serious blank in the story. Now with this portion, I was enabled to make it nearly complete." Although the flood story got most of the press at the time, it was part of a remarkable poem that we call the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I mentioned earlier. The poem is very long. Modern translations cover at least 40 pages. It's also the best-known work of literature from Mesopotamia. We now have many more copies of it from other ancient sites, but it was first identified in the library at Nineveh. The author was a man named Sin-Leke-Unini, who lived around 1200 BCE. Like the later Greek poet Homer, who was of course said to have written down the Iliad and the Odyssey, Sin-Leke-Unini took legends that had been passed down orally, along with some earlier written versions of the epic, and he rewrote them and put them together into a literary masterpiece. His work was copied over and over again, and ended up in Ashurbanipal's library some 500 years later. Gilgamesh probably was a real king who would have lived about 2,000 years before Ashurbanipal. I say probably because no evidence of him survives from his own time. But we know that some people mentioned with Gilgamesh in various tales were real, so he probably was too. The epic wasn't the only literary work to mention Gilgamesh, but already in older stories he was something of a superhero. They said that he was victorious over not just human enemies but monsters as well. He was thought to have had some divine blood. He even had conversations with gods. But he was still fundamentally seen as human. And to start with, his story had nothing to do with a flood. The Mesopotamians had told tales about a great flood, though, which they thought had happened tens of thousands of years in the past. The Mesopotamians' flood story was always similar to the one in the Bible, but in earlier versions, the hero of the tale didn't always have the same name. Sometimes he was Atrahasis, sometimes he was Ziusudra. By the time the Epic of Gilgamesh was written, he was named Utnapishtim. Sin-Leke-Unini took the Gilgamesh stories and the flood story, and he combined them into a single epic. His hero, Gilgamesh, was haunted by one of the great human dilemmas. He realized that he was going to die, and he didn't want to. Gilgamesh also had plenty of flaws. He was brash and arrogant, and the people he ruled, in the city of Uruk in southern Mesopotamia, were tired of him. At the beginning of the story, the citizens of Uruk ask the gods for relief from his demands, and the gods comply. They create a man who would be a match for the king. His name is Enkidu. Enkidu starts out like a wild creature, apparently convinced that he's one of the animals of the steppe. But he's tamed by a prostitute who convinces him that he is a man, and she brings him to Uruk. After fighting to a draw with Gilgamesh, Enkidu becomes the king's close friend, and they go off together on further adventures. The two companions imagine that they will make names for themselves and gain immortality, and they decide to do this by defeating a ferocious creature named Humbaba. Sin-Leke-Unini wrote this speech for Gilgamesh: "I will conquer Humbaba in the forest of cedar. I will establish forever a name eternal." After a long battle, our heroes manage to defeat Humbaba. This makes the gods take notice. Gilgamesh even attracts the attentions of the goddess Ishtar, who was known for her passions. She was the goddess of both love and war. The poem continues. On the beauty of Gilgamesh, Lady Ishtar looked with longing. Come, Gilgamesh, be you my bridegroom. Grant me your fruits, O grant me. Be you my husband and I your wife. But Gilgamesh wasn't interested. He knows all about Ishtar's reputation for mistreating men, and he wants nothing to do with her. He calls her a shoe that bites the foot of its owner, and a lot of other nasty things. Ishtar is furious about Gilgamesh's rejection. She asks her father, the god Anu, to send a creature called the Bull of Heaven to punish Gilgamesh. But again, Gilgamesh and Enkidu prevail. They are able to kill the Bull of Heaven. They cut out its heart and take it to the sun god. Now Ishtar is even madder than before. Hopping and stamping she wailed in woe, Alas, Gilgamesh who mocked me has killed the Bull of Heaven. The two heroes have become too self-confident. Now, Sin-Leke-Unini changes the mood of his story and shows how Gilgamesh and Enkidu will be punished for their hubris. Enkidu wakes up one morning and tells Gilgamesh about a disturbing dream he's had. It was a vision of the afterlife, which he describes as dull and unpleasant. It was, he says, the house which none who enters ever leaves, on the path that allows no journey back. People there had no light, they ate clay, and wore feathers like birds. Even former kings and priests were stuck there, with no special privileges. The Mesopotamians believed that dreams came from the gods, so clearly Enkidu has received a premonition of his own death. Sure enough, he grows weaker and sicker, and a few days later he dies. Gilgamesh waits with the body for days, in disbelief, until a worm falls out of Enkidu's nose. Then he accepts that his friend is dead. Still, he mourns and wails for him. He walks around and around the body, and he tears out his hair and rips off his fine clothes. He's devastated. Enkidu is given an elaborate burial and lots of valuable grave goods. But something bigger is bothering Gilgamesh. If his dearest friend can die, then he faces the same fate. Tablet 9 of the epic finds Gilgamesh roaming around, disconsolate, and wondering what to do. He says, I shall die, and shall I not be then as Enkidu? Sorrow has entered my heart. I am afraid of death, so I wander the wild. The gods aren't very reassuring. The sun god speaks to him directly, stating, O Gilgamesh, where are you wandering? The life that you seek, you will never find. Still, Gilgamesh is undeterred. He has a plan. There's one mortal man he's heard of who has managed to live forever. If Gilgamesh can find this man, he will learn the secret of immortality. That man is Utnapishtim, the hero from the story of the flood. Eventually, a woman who's a tavern keeper and a man who ferries people on boats help Gilgamesh find the distant land where Utnapishtim lives with his wife. And here, at last, we come to Tablet 11 and the story of the flood. So, although this had previously been a completely separate story, Sin-Leke-Unini now brings it into the epic as part of Gilgamesh's search for eternal life. And it does make sense. Gilgamesh disappears from the narrative at this point, and Utnapishtim becomes the storyteller. The flood tale is told in his words, all about how he survived in his boat. At the end, and this is quite unlike the story of Noah, the god who'd caused the flood in the first place decides to give eternal life to Utnapishtim and his wife. So, Gilgamesh has heard this whole story, but how is it supposed to help him? Another flood isn't about to happen. Gilgamesh can't duplicate Utnapishtim's experience. In fact, he can't even stay awake for more than a day. Utnapishtim tests him, and Gilgamesh fails. If he can't keep sleep away, how can he possibly defeat death? Gilgamesh is disconsolate. After all that searching, he has nothing to show for it. He says to the central character of this epic narrative, O Utnapishtim, what should I do and where should I go? A thief has taken hold of my flesh, for there in my bedchamber death does abide, and wherever I turn, there too will be death. Utnapishtim, then presents Gilgamesh with an incredible gift. Directions for finding a plant that will make him young again. The plant of heartbeat. Gilgamesh dives into the ocean to get the plant, and then he says to the boatman, "I will eat it myself and be again as I was in my youth." You can feel his excitement. All is not lost. He can put off death for ages now. But Gilgamesh is careless. Before eating the plant, he leaves it by a pond while bathing. It's stolen by a snake, which sheds its skin and becomes young, while Gilgamesh is condemned to die just as before. And now, Sinleke writes that Gilgamesh sat down and wept. This seems like a tragedy. The moral of the story seems to be that everyone will die, even a hero who could kill divine monsters, even someone on speaking terms with the gods. But there is a note of optimism at the end. Gilgamesh says this to his boatman as they finally get home to Uruk. "Climb Uruk's wall and walk back and forth. Survey its foundations, examine the brickwork. Were its bricks not fired in an oven? Did the 7 sages not lay its foundations? A square mile is city, a square mile is date grove, a square mile is clay pit, half a square mile the temple of Ishtar, 3 square miles and a half is Uruk's expanse." This might not seem like an obvious happy ending, but Gilgamesh is describing the city he rules, and apparently with pride. His city was founded by the gods, and it was a wonder to behold, 3.5 square miles in extent and made of baked bricks. In Gilgamesh's time, it was the largest and most modern city on the planet. In making this speech, Gilgamesh seems to have reconciled himself to his earthly and mortal existence as a king of an impressive kingdom. He can stop wandering the earth looking for immortality. There is so much in this epic tale that is really quite profound. And even hundreds of years before Sinleke set down these words, the story of Gilgamesh was already a deeply thoughtful meditation on life and death. As seen in Enkidu's dream, the Mesopotamians didn't have any heaven to look forward to. The afterlife was dull and endless for everyone. In believing this, they were like most ancient peoples. But they still believed in their gods because there was no other option. Religion didn't include a heavenly reward at that time. It was all about serving the gods and being rewarded in this life. So Gilgamesh's quest for immortality would have resonated with his audience, and the ultimate message was one of hope. In a version from the Old Babylonian period, at least 500 years earlier, the innkeeper gives a lovely speech that supplies one lesson of the tale. The innkeeper tells Gilgamesh, "The life that you seek you will never find. When the gods created mankind, death they dispensed to mankind, life they kept for themselves. But you, Gilgamesh, let your belly be full, enjoy yourself always by day and by night, make merry each day, dance and play day and night. Let your clothes be clean, let your head be washed, may you bathe in water. Gaze on the child who holds your hand, let your wife enjoy your repeated embrace, for such is the destiny of mortal men." Of course, Gilgamesh ignores her advice and goes on searching for Utnapishtim, but this speech strikes me as instructive. The tavern keeper doesn't tell him to be kingly or to go and fight enemies. She tells him to enjoy his wife and child, eat well, and be merry. This advice would apply to anyone, not just to a king. It seems to have been a common Mesopotamian belief that you only live once, so seize the day and enjoy what you have, rather than trying to attain privileges that are reserved for the gods like eternal life. Textbooks often tell us that the Mesopotamians were depressed, anxious, pessimistic people, and I don't buy it. The one thing, you can't stereotype a whole population like that, whether they're ancient or modern. And when you read the many different documents written in Mesopotamia, you see that, for the most part, they followed the innkeeper's advice to enjoy life. Perhaps their dismal view of the afterlife made them appreciate living all the more. The Epic of Gilgamesh has many other themes as well, like the importance of friendship and not upsetting the gods. and the idea that pride comes before a fall. This tale was very popular and was translated into other ancient languages. Fragments of it have been found at a number of sites across the Near East. King Ashurbanipal kept more than one copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh in his library, but most of the library texts were more practical. The majority of them were records of omens and divination. So when almost anything happened in the night sky, such as an eclipse of the moon or the appearance of a planet in a particular constellation, scholars consulted the omen texts to find out what this portended. By the time of Ashurbanipal, priests had kept accurate diaries of the movements of the planets and stars for about a century. They were even able to predict when eclipses would take place, but not where they would be observed, and where the planets would appear in the sky. But even then, the Mesopotamians believed that the gods were sending messages that way. If the king wanted an answer to a particular question, he could ask his diviners to practice extispicy. This was figuring out the will of the gods by reading the internal organs of sacrificed sheep and goats. The shape of the liver of the sacrificed animal was thought to be particularly useful. Each bump and depression and deformation of the liver was thought to have meaning that could be interpreted by the diviner. I've been told that in mammals, the liver has more variation than any other organ, so perhaps that made it a particularly good way to ascertain the messages that the gods wanted to send. The diviners of Mesopotamia couldn't just make things up. Their discoveries were believed to be predictable and scientific. They had to look up old reference books, reference tablets, to find out what had happened in the past when the same signs had been observed. Priests and officials often cited omens and oracles when they wrote to the king. It's quite possible that they consulted the royal library when they did so. Some tablets in the library had belonged to King Ashurbanipal's father and grandfather. Others were copied in Nineveh by scribes employed by Ashurbanipal himself, and some were copied from tablets seized in Babylonia, or they were written by Babylonian scribes who had been captured and forced to work in the king's library. Ashurbanipal also commissioned scribes in other cities to copy texts and send them to him. So the Assyrians were interested in big questions of human existence, and they systematically collected and organized knowledge and made accurate astronomical observations. Their endeavors moved people a step closer to what we now know as philosophy and science. As king, Ashurbanipal seems to have been determined to have access to as much written knowledge as he possibly could, even while he also tried to rule according to the wishes of the gods. King Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria might originally have been a rebel, or he might have been someone who suppressed rebels who were trying to usurp the legitimate dynasty. Either way, he hadn't been directly in line for the throne, and he really benefited from a rebellion that broke out in the mid-8th century BCE. This chaotic time ultimately resulted in the legitimate king being deposed and Tiglath-Pileser III taking the throne. By this time, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was the biggest empire the world had ever known. It extended across Mesopotamia, Syria, and the Levant, and included parts of Anatolia as well. But the imperial structure was in some disarray. It had been set up more than a century earlier by one of Tiglath-Pileser's predecessors, King Ashurnazirpal II, and now it badly needed a reboot. Provincial governors had become quite independent, and rebellions had been occurring in many places. Once Tiglath-Pileser III took power, he instigated many changes, and the Assyrian administration finally mastered the running of an empire. The new king redrew the boundaries of provinces, making them smaller, and his governors, who were now less powerful, depended on him for their positions. The king also created a fast system of communication so that messages were passed between couriers riding on horseback. The messenger and his horse could rest after a day of riding, but the message continued on with a new carrier. So the message never had to pause. It was much like the later Pony Express in America. The king could be informed much more quickly this way about any problems that developed across the empire. Tiglath-Pileser III also expanded the empire into areas that had never been subject to Assyria before, and he forced these lands to pay tribute. The economies of these vassal states were streamlined so that resources were used efficiently. With these reforms, during the mid-8th century BCE, the Assyrian Empire reached a period when it was at the height of its power. But only 135 years after Tiglath-Pileser III came to power, the empire fell. One of the foreign lands that Tiglath-Pileser took control of was Babylonia. The Assyrians worshipped Babylonian gods and respected Babylonia as an ancient civilization. Honestly, Assyria was a little bit in awe of Babylonia, and the Babylonians got special privileges under Assyrian rule. But one complication about being brought into the empire was that the Babylonians had a long tradition with regard to their king. Under this tradition, the legitimate king of Babylon had to take the hand of the god Marduk during a special ceremony during the New Year's festival. And that ceremony could only happen in Babylon. The king seems to have literally grasped the hand of the statue of the god Marduk. This gesture and the whole ceremony symbolized the king's devotion to the god and his devotion to Babylon. Tiglath-Pileser III actually did this, even though, like all Assyrian kings, he was personally devoted to the god Ashur. He took the hand of Marduk and ruled Babylon directly. But at other times, the Assyrian kings put their sons on the Babylonian throne, or appointed Babylonian kings who were loyal to Assyria. Sometimes this worked, but often it didn't. The Babylonians didn't like being ruled by Assyria. They had been a great power for such a long time, more than 1,000 years by the time of Tiglath-Pileser III, that they didn't think much of being subject to outsiders. But from the time that Tiglath-Pileser took over, the Babylonian throne changed hands 20 times in just 100 years. That's an average reign of just 5 years. Plus, the Babylonians had more than just the Assyrians to worry about. A group of people in the far south, called the Chaldeans, also often tried to take over Babylon. It was a mess, and things came to a head during the reign of a king named Sennacherib, ruled Assyria from 704 to 681 BCE. Although Sennacherib started out ruling Babylonia directly, he didn't take the hand of Marduk for some reason. So the Babylonians might never have really viewed him as legitimate. After 2 years, his rule in Babylonia was overthrown. A Babylonian took the hand of Marduk instead. But this man was quickly deposed by a usurper named Merodach-Baladan, who had wanted to rule Babylon for a long time, and had the help of the neighboring Elamites. The Elamite kingdom was in the southwestern part of what is now Iran. Of course, Sennacherib was still king of the rest of the Assyrian Empire, and he viewed Merodach-Baladan as an evil villain. So he sent in his forces to bring the region back under Assyrian control. Merodach-Baladan fled, and this time, Sennacherib put a puppet king on the throne, a Babylonian who was loyal to Assyria. But that didn't work either, and Sennacherib decided that he needed to have his own son on the throne in Babylonia. This might have seemed like a good idea, but it turned out to be a disaster. After a few years, the Elamites raided Babylonia, and they took Sennacherib's son away. We don't know what happened to him. Presumably it wasn't good. The Babylonians once again appointed a local king, and once again Sennacherib's army showed up to remove him. You can imagine that the Babylonians were getting angrier and angrier with the Assyrians. So again, the Babylonians chose a local king, and this time they formed an alliance with several neighboring kingdoms, including their former enemies, the Chaldeans and the Elamites, to attack the Assyrian army. They fought a vicious, bloody battle, but neither side clearly won the day. Sennacherib must have been furious. His son was gone, and the Babylonians had repeatedly rejected Assyrian rule. So, in 690 BCE, he took a huge army and he attacked the capital city of Babylon. When the Babylonians didn't give up, the Assyrians set up a siege around the city. These two great powers, they were like twins in a way. Their people spoke the same language. They worshipped the same gods. They had much the same culture and history. Babylonia was the older society, Assyria the younger one. But you'd think they would have been natural allies, and now they were enemies. In 689, Sennacherib's forces entered Babylon. They didn't hold back. According to Sennacherib's annals, the Assyrians sacked with a vengeance. They destroyed temples, houses, and palaces, and they redirected the river so that water swamped parts of the city. They even took the statue of the god Marduk away from Babylon. This, of course, wasn't seen as a statue, it was the god himself. The Babylonians saw the Assyrians' attack on the temples as blasphemy. Even some Assyrians would have been worried. After all, they worshipped Babylonian gods too. Soon after this, the Assyrians began rebuilding the city of Babylon. But the relationship between the two kingdoms was damaged, and the Elamites were now aligned against Assyria as well. Sennacherib had led fierce campaigns into their land too, so the Assyrians were gaining some pretty powerful enemies. Sennacherib had achieved other things in his reign too, of course, besides subduing Babylon. He'd moved the capital to the ancient city of Nineveh, near the modern city of Mosul. And he'd sponsored a massive building program there, doubling the size of the city. Nineveh was absolutely enormous for an ancient city. It covered about 1,750 acres, and its population might have been as much as 230,000. To give you a sense of scale, it was about 15 times the size of Jerusalem at the same time, and had about 23 times as many people living there. The new capital needed a regular water supply for its vast population and for its many orchards and gardens. So Sennacherib oversaw the construction of a 60-mile-long canal that brought water from the mountains. At one point, the canal had to pass across a valley. So the Assyrian engineers created a stone aqueduct 30 feet high. The inscription on the aqueduct says, in Sennacherib's words, "Over deep-cut ravines, I spanned a bridge of white stone blocks. I caused those waters to flow over it." Sennacherib's new palace in Nineveh was bigger and more impressive than the palaces that had come before. Like his predecessor, Ashurnazirpal II, from the 9th century BCE, Sennacherib commissioned stone relief sculptures for the walls of the palace that showed his great military victories over his enemies. Some of the reliefs depict gardens on top of buildings. Now, we're used to seeing this in modern cities. You can see trees growing at the tops of skyscrapers in pretty much any city. And Milan even has a vertical forest with trees and shrubs on every balcony. But in ancient times, this type of planting would have seemed miraculous. Imagine the engineering feat involved. First, the walls and the roof had to support the weight of all that soil and water, as well as the trees. Then you had to get water up to the roof, without modern plumbing. Sennacherib's aqueduct helped to make these gardens possible. Stephanie Daly, a historian at Oxford University, has put forward a fascinating suggestion. These incredible gardens at Nineveh, in the northern part of Mesopotamia, might be the source of the legend of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, even though Babylon was hundreds of miles to the south. Later Greek and Roman authors claimed that a Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar had constructed the gardens in Babylon soon after the end of the Assyrian Empire. But there's no archaeological evidence in Babylon for hanging gardens, and no one who visited Babylon at the time, or even for centuries afterward, ever mentioned them, as far as we know. Even the Greek historian Herodotus, who seems to have gone to Babylon in the 5th century BCE, and described all the wonders of the city, even he never mentioned a hanging garden. When the gardens were eventually described as gardens on top of a building, they were considered to be one of the wonders of the ancient world. But this was much later, long after the Assyrian and Babylonian civilizations had ended. Now, the Greeks and Romans were forever getting Babylonia and Assyria confused. So it's quite possible that they confused Nineveh with Babylon. And Sennacherib described the gardens of his palace as being a wonder. His engineers even seem to have invented a water screw to pump water uphill, like the one invented much later by Archimedes. So perhaps the ancient wonder should have been called the Hanging Gardens of Nineveh. In any event, the Assyrian Empire was technologically advanced in Sennacherib's time, but it was having problems with its neighbors to the south and east, Babylonia and Elam. In 681 BCE, Sennacherib was assassinated by one of his sons. The prince who took over the throne wasn't one of the deceased king's oldest sons, and he wasn't one of the assassins either. But he was the son of one of Sennacherib's favorite wives, Nakiah, and he'd been named crown prince before the assassination. His name was Esarhaddon, and Esarhaddon had to fight his brother for the throne in a brief civil war. The Assyrian army divided against itself. It was a foretaste of things to come. In the coming decades, civil wars in Assyria would become more frequent. Esarhaddon is an interesting person. He was more fragile than his father, and on as many as 8 occasions, omens were recorded suggesting that his life was in danger. For example, an eclipse of the sun was a sure sign that the king would die. So, he took precautions in the same way that many Mesopotamian kings had done before him. He officially stepped down from the throne, and a substitute king was appointed in his place. Esarhaddon took the title of farmer while actually still ruling. After a set amount of time passed, the substitute king was put to death. That way the omen had come true, and then the real king resumed his throne. The Cuds had to be right after all, and this way they were, but without the real king having to die. Esarhaddon decided to expand the Assyrian Empire to its largest extent yet, by conquering Egypt. Through thousands of years of civilization up to this time, Egypt had been one of the richest places in the world. It had abundant natural resources, including gold, which everyone else in the region wanted, and its fields produced vast amounts of grain. The Assyrians controlled much of the Levant already. Israel had been conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BCE, and many of its people had been deported across the empire. This is recorded in the Bible, as well as in Assyrian records. Other kingdoms in the region had also been conquered. Judah, with its capital at Jerusalem, was supposed to pay tribute to Assyria, but sometimes it failed to do so. It's clear from the Bible, and from other sources as well, that Egypt had been helping Israel, Judah, and other states in the region to rebel against Assyria. So perhaps in Esarhaddon's mind, Egypt needed to be controlled. It didn't hurt that there was immense wealth there that could be looted. But ultimately, the attempt to bring Egypt into the empire didn't go well. The first conquest in 671 was successful, and Esarhaddon gave new Assyrian names to the Egyptian cities. The Assyrians sacked the northern capital city of Memphis, and a northern Egyptian ruler took on the role of being a vassal to Assyria. But the southern part of Egypt wasn't happy with the arrangement, and soon after Esarhaddon left, there were rebellions. So Esarhaddon and the Assyrian army headed back to Egypt in 669 BCE. At this point, Esarhaddon became ill, and he died en route. The Assyrians didn't keep going, and Egypt soon left the empire. Maybe it was just too far away for the Assyrians to control. Although the end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire was still 60 years in the future, we can see, with the benefit of hindsight, that seeds of its failure were sown. The Egyptian campaigns had been expensive. More importantly, they had been unsuccessful. Assyria had always seemed unstoppable before this. the Assyrian army was always victorious. The Egyptian achievement in breaking away must have given hope to some people in the various provinces that perhaps they too might be able to successfully rebel. Meanwhile, the lands of Babylonia and Elam were unhappy with their situation. They had been attacked brutally by the Assyrian army in Sennacherib's time, and even though Esarhaddon spent a lot of wealth and manpower in rebuilding Babylon, the Assyrians still had enemies there. Furthermore, the civil war between princes when Esarhaddon took over had set a precedent. In planning his own succession, Esarhaddon had made one of his sons, Ashurbanipal, crown prince. Another son, Shamash-shuma-ukin, was made the viceroy in Babylon. Now you'll remember that Sennacherib had also tried this. His eldest son had been captured by the Elamites and presumably killed. It wasn't easy to rule Babylon. When Esarhaddon died, Ashurbanipal became king of Assyria and Shamash-shuma-ukin was king of Babylonia, but in a subordinate role to his brother. For 17 years, this system worked quite well. During this time, Ashurbanipal built up his library at Nineveh and attended to other issues in the northern parts of the empire. Even the Elamites were at peace with Assyria. But in 653 BCE, Ashurbanipal went to war against his eastern neighbors and he was victorious. A relief sculpture in his palace shows the king in a garden relaxing on a couch. His wife is next to him and they're both having a drink. Servants fan them and birds are flying overhead. It all looks very tranquil. Until you look carefully, and you notice a decapitated head hanging in the tree next to them. That head belonged to the Elamite king. A year after the war, the Assyrian king of Babylon, Shamash-shuma-ukin, launched a rebellion against his brother Ashurbanipal. And not surprisingly, the Elamites helped. Civil war erupted again, ending with Ashurbanipal's troops besieging Babylon for 2 years. Some of the people still alive in Babylon at this time must have been survivors of the siege of 689 BCE, 40 years before. These people would have dealt with famine and disease during the first siege and lived through the destruction and pillage. Since then, they'd seen the city rebuilt. But now they were dealing with a siege all over again. All of it was because of the Assyrians. Babylon finally fell in 648, and Shamash-shuma-ukin died. Ashurbanipal wrote about his brother's death this way. He said that the Assyrian gods had cast his hostile brother into the burning flames and destroyed him. At this point, there's a problem. The records begin to dry up. We don't even know the date of the end of Ashurbanipal's reign. It was probably around 630 BCE. In 612 BCE, 18 years later, Nineveh was conquered by a coalition of Babylonians and a people from Persia called the Medes. But there aren't any Assyrian records to tell us what happened. The Babylonian sources aren't very helpful either. The Medes seem to have come out of nowhere. So what happened? It does seem as though peace was restored after Ashurbanipal triumphed in the war against his brother. But once Ashurbanipal died, yet another civil war erupted between two princes who both wanted to rule Assyria. And there was a struggle for the throne in Babylonia as well between two Babylonians. In Babylonia, the man who won was named Nabopolassar. He wasn't a member of the previous royal family at all. In Assyria, the prince who was victorious was Sin-shar-ishkun, a son of Ashurbanipal. Oh, guess what happened next? Right? Sin-shar-ishkun and Nabopolassar went to war against one another. By now, these civil wars and wars between Assyria and Babylonia had been going on for more than 100 years. And yet, in all this time, whenever Babylonia and Assyria had been at war, the battles had always taken place in Babylonia. The Assyrian heartland hadn't been threatened. And eventually, the Assyrians had always won. No army from outside Assyria had ever campaigned into Assyria. Even though the Assyrian cities all had nice big defensive walls, they'd never been needed. But in 617 BCE, Nabopolassar moved his army north up the Euphrates. He didn't threaten the Assyrian heartland yet, but he was able to conquer regions Assyria controlled in the west of the empire. For the Assyrians, this was even worse than losing Egypt, because Egypt had only been under Assyrian control for a very short time. In comparison, the region on the Euphrates had been in the empire for centuries. 3 years later, the Medes, from what is now Iran, went on the offensive in the Assyrian heartland. They attacked the big cities, Ashur, Kalhu, and Nineveh, and they conquered Ashur. Think about that. It had been the religious capital of Assyria for more than 1,000 years. It was home to their all-powerful god Ashur. Now it was in the hands of foreigners. Imagine if, say, the Mongols had made it to Italy in the 13th century and had conquered Rome. The effect on the Assyrians was probably something like that. The Medes then joined forces with the Babylonians and the Elamites and kept pushing into Assyria. 2 diplomatic letters survive from this time, written by Sin-shar-ishkun of Assyria and Nabopolassar of Babylon. They show that the Assyrians were in a very bad position. Today, we can see how this had been building up, and we know the outcome. We know that the Assyrian Empire fell. But at the time, it must have been a huge shock for the Assyrians to realize they were actually in danger. For 300 years, the Assyrian Empire had been the only great power in the Near East. It had been more than 500 years since the Assyrian heartland had been attacked. There was no way to conceive of any other world. But Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, after a siege of only 3 months. An archaeological expedition from UC Berkeley has found evidence of the siege when they were digging at the city of Nineveh in 1990. The excavation showed that the city's stone gates were beautifully constructed. Originally, they were about 20 feet wide, but the gateways had been hastily narrowed to just 6 feet, with much cruder construction techniques, and this was probably when Assyria was first invaded in 614 BCE. A 20-foot wide gate might have done a fine job of welcoming visitors and traders, messengers and artisans at the height of the empire, but it was way too wide to defend against the Medes and the Babylonians, and there were 15 of these gates. And then the archaeologists found an even more graphic relic of the invasion, a tangled group of 12 skeletons of men and boys. These weren't formal burials. The bodies were all crumpled, lying right where they'd fallen down. They must have been residents of Nineveh who died when the Babylonians and Medes swept into the city. The skeletons were surrounded by arrowheads, along with a dagger, a spear, and the pike. One 13-year-old boy had an arrowhead still stuck in his leg. The Assyrian army held on and made its last stand in the Syrian city of Haran 3 years after Nineveh fell. But the end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire is usually dated to 612 BCE, with the destruction of Nineveh. The way the conquerors treated Assyria was horrific. Cities across the heartland were looted, burned, and leveled. Populations were killed or they fled, and most cities weren't reoccupied for decades, if ever. That includes the great capital cities of Ashur, Kalhu, and Nineveh. It was much worse than the way the Assyrians had treated Babylon in the time of Sennacherib. Sarah Melville, a Clarkson University scholar who studies this period, has made a new interpretation of this. She notes that the Babylonian records state that the devastation in Assyria wasn't the fault of the Babylonians. Rather, it was done by the Medes. And the Babylonians claimed that they were shocked by how the Medes had treated the Assyrians. Now, this might sound a little like avoiding the blame, but it might have been true. Remember, the Babylonians and Assyrians shared the same culture, religion, and language. They had a long and complicated relationship, but they respected one another. Melville believes they also shared some rules about combat and about the treatment of defeated enemies. These rules wouldn't have included destroying everything in sight. The usual thing was to take over and rule the conquered cities, not burn them right down. The Medes, however, didn't share their culture and didn't have an organized state, nor did they follow the Mesopotamian rules. As for why Assyria fell, Melville argues that the Assyrians simply weren't prepared to fight defensively. After centuries of being on the offensive, expanding their empire, and not needing to defend it, they made mistakes. They didn't switch to fighting defensively until it was too late, and their cities weren't designed for the change in tactics. Those wide city gates hadn't been built to keep a foreign army out. Of course, there were other reasons for the fall of Assyria as well. As we've seen, the Assyrians were pretty unpopular with many of their subjects, and the long history of Assyrian efforts to control Babylonia had given the Babylonians a good reason to go on the attack. And although the Assyrian administration had no sense of such things as gross domestic product or budget deficits, it looks as though their government was spending much more than it was taking in at this time. Expensive undertakings, like the attempt to conquer Egypt and all those civil wars, had sucked up a lot of wealth. It even looks as though the population was shrinking, which would have reduced tribute and taxes. The very fact that Assyria had started losing wars might also have worsened morale. As long as the Assyrians were always victorious, people probably believed that the god Ashur simply couldn't be defeated. In the Bible, there's a speech by an Assyrian official who obviously believed this. He was trying to convince the people of Jerusalem to surrender before the Assyrian army even attacked. The official says, "Has the God of any nation ever delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Who of all the gods of the countries has been able to save his land from me?" Assyria and the god Ashur just couldn't be resisted. In the end, the Assyrian Empire wasn't warned much. Some writers in the Bible were obviously thrilled to see it fall, and people in other lands might have said similar things. But most of those lands that had been subject to Assyria didn't suddenly gain their independence. The beneficiary of the fall of Assyria ended up being Babylonia. Nabopolassar, the Babylonian king, took control of much of the former Assyrian Empire, but he and later rulers of what we call the Neo-Babylonian Empire were the last indigenous rulers of Mesopotamia for hundreds of years. For a Neo-Babylonian king to be considered legitimate, back in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, he had to go through a ritual called taking the hand of Marduk. Marduk was the patron god of the city of Babylon, and he was one of the most important gods in Mesopotamia. In this ritual, the king apparently held the hand of the sacred statue of Marduk while standing next to it. This showed that the god and the king ruled together. Marduk and his divine wife Zarpanatum lived in a vast temple called the Esangil at the center of Babylon. But in 689 BCE, when invading Assyrians attacked Babylon, the troops of the Assyrian king Sennacherib removed the statue of Marduk and took it to Assyria. Marduk wasn't returned home until 668 BCE. No matter how much the Assyrian kings did during the intervening years to rebuild the city's monuments, Babylon was a city without a god for 21 years. Sennacherib's son Esarhaddon could and did call himself the king of Babylonia, but it didn't mean the Babylonians accepted him as their rightful king. That's because he couldn't go through the ritual of taking the hand of Marduk in Babylon. He couldn't because Marduk wasn't in Babylon. So, in Babylonian eyes, their land had no true king for 2 decades. You might be thinking, why didn't the Babylonians just make a new statue of Marduk to replace the one that had been stolen? Well, for the Mesopotamians, it didn't work that way. At some point in the distant past, this very statue had been brought to life as Marduk. And as long as that statue existed, that was where Marduk was. So if the statue was away from Babylon, then Marduk was too. This was true of all gods and goddesses. But in Marduk's case, it wasn't just that the god was gone from the city. Babylonians felt that the whole orderly functioning of the universe was at risk when Marduk was away. In order to understand all of this, it helps to know something about the Babylonian New Year's festival, called the Akitu Festival. It was the big religious event of the Babylonian year, and it lasted for 12 days. but it could take place only when Marduk and the Babylonian king were both in town. We know what happened during the Akitu festival because a ritual program was written down, recording all the actions that had to be performed, and the words of all the prayers that had to be spoken. It's a fascinating document, revealing that the kings of Babylon had a very different role in their state religion than the kings of Assyria had. The kings of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which had lasted from 911 to 612 BCE, were high priests of the god Ashur, heads of the government and of the religion. Ashur was the great god of the Assyrian pantheon, equivalent to Marduk in Babylonia. In Babylonia, the king wasn't a priest, but he still had a vital role to play in the Akitu festival. No one else could replace him. Now, most of the events of the festival were kept secret. Babylonian citizens weren't directly involved, but they trusted that the proper ceremonies were taking place. On the first days, deep in the most sacred halls of the Esangil temple, priests purified themselves and recited prayers, and sang hymns to Marduk and his divine wife Zarpanatum while standing right in front of their statues. The priests didn't call them by name, though. They called Marduk Bel, which meant Lord, and they called Zarpanatum Beltir, which meant Lady. This was fairly common across the Near East. You see the same idea in Canaan, in the Levant. There, the people referred to their great god as Baal, which also meant Lord. A crucial moment of the Akitu festival was when the high priest recited out loud the entire text of the Babylonian creation epic. This was on the third day of the festival. The priest stood alone in the presence of the god, reminding him, by reciting the epic, of the history of the world and of Marduk's greatness and his role in maintaining cosmic order. This epic had a kind of magic to it. Although the Mesopotamians had several different creation stories at different times, this was the one that the Babylonians held as sacred, because it focused on their god, Marduk. The epic was set in the primordial past, and it told the story of how everything in the universe had come into being, and how Marduk came to be the king of the gods. The Babylonians believed that before anything else existed, there was water. Salty seawater was called Tiamat, she was a goddess, and sweet spring water was Apsu, he was a god. All the other gods were the children and descendants of these two. One of these later gods was Marduk, who was described as outstanding in every possible way. The story went on to say that the gods ended up going to war against one another. One group of gods sided with the saltwater goddess Tiamat. She had snakes, dragons, and demons on her side. The leader of her army was an evil god named Kingu. The other group sided with a god named Ea, who had taken control of the sweet waters. In the creation story, Ea was definitely the protagonist, and Tiamat was the antagonist. Actually, Ea, who was also known as Enki, was almost always the good guy in Mesopotamian myths. Water was inevitably a good thing. You used it to drink and to water your crops, so it makes sense that its god was also always good. At this point in the story, Ea needed help in his fight against Tiamat, and he asked Marduk to lead his forces. Marduk agreed. There's an added complication here. Tiamat had control of an object called the Tablet of Destinies. The Babylonians believed that this mythical tablet held the power to bring order out of chaos. Everything in the universe went according to plan, so long as a sensible good god had control of the Tablet of Destinies. The sun rose every day, crops grew, animals procreated, babies were born. The rivers provided irrigation water. Things were orderly. But if an unpredictable, erratic god had the Tablet of Destinies, then anything could happen. Chaos would reign. At this point in the story, right before the battle between Tiamat and Marduk, the gods still existed in a universe of water and wind, with no land or cities or human beings. Then Tiamat gave the Tablet of Destinies to her evil sidekick Kingu, which was definitely a problem. Chaos was coming. At a banquet held before the battle, Marduk was given sovereignty over the whole universe. by the gods who were on the side of Ea and goodness. The armies of the gods didn't end up fighting one another. Instead, Tiamat and Marduk fought in single combat hand to hand. After struggling against one another, Marduk forced the wind into Tiamat, inflating her like a balloon. Then he killed her with an arrow. He also killed her commander Kingu and took control of the Tablet of Destinies. At this point in the story, a Babylonian would probably breathe a sigh of relief. The tablet was back in the hands of a sensible god. Order would be restored. And Marduk actually went about creating order out of Tiamat. He split her body in half like a clamshell and made it into the sky and the earth. Then he created shrines for the gods. It's interesting that the Babylonians thought the shrines had originally been created by the gods themselves. You can understand why they never ever wanted to move a shrine or a temple. As the creation story continues, Marduk created the constellations of stars in the sky, and he created the moon. Then he made weather, and he made springs and mountains, and the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. After this, Marduk gave the Tablet of Destinies to one of the oldest gods, the god of the heavens, Anu. Anu would keep it safe. The other gods then had a ceremony to thank Marduk. They gave him gifts and worshipped him. He was clearly the king of the gods at this point. He put a crown on his head, and he put on royal robes. And then he made a speech, announcing that he would live in Babylon, at the center of the world, and that other gods were welcome there. Remember, this is still a world without humans. The Mesopotamians believed that the gods had created everything just for themselves, even the cities. They were immortal and powerful, but they still had to do all the work of providing for themselves. Then Marduk made a decision to save the gods some labor. He would create a new creature, something that was not a god, but that would work for the gods. These would be humans. The god Ea used blood from the dead evil god Kingu to make humankind. At the end of this creation story, Marduk gave the gods their various realms, and they built the city of Babylon, and then had another banquet. They swore an oath to support Marduk. The very act of reciting this story to the statue of Marduk helped restore order to the universe. Doing so every year, at the time of the new year, assured that chaos wouldn't sneak in. The Akitu festival continued after the creation epic was recited. More purifications took place, and more prayers were recited, and hymns were sung. Then a really strange ritual took place. Scholars have argued endlessly about what it meant. Here's what happened. The king of Babylonia washed his hands and came to the temple of Marduk, where he was greeted by the high priest. Just the two of them were present for this very important part of the festival. The priest was required to take away the king's scepter, circle, and sword and put them on a chair in front of the god. These were the symbols of kingship. Then the priest came back to the room where the king was waiting and struck him on the cheek. He hit him. He was required to. After that, the priest took the king into the holy room where Marduk's statue was located. Here's what the ritual text says next, and I quote, "He, the priest, shall drag the king by the ears and make him bow down to the ground. The king shall speak the following only once. I did not sin, Lord of the countries. I was not neglectful of the requirements of your godship. I did not destroy Babylon. I did not command its overthrow. I did not do something," this word is broken in the text, "to the temple Esangil. I did not forget its rituals. I did not rain blows on the cheek of a subordinate. I did not humiliate them. I watched out for Babylon. I did not smash its walls." This is an amazing speech. The king was bowing on the ground, groveling in front of the god, swearing an oath that he had been good to Marduk and to his city and his temple. He even swore that he hadn't humiliated people who were his subordinates, which was pretty much everyone. You can imagine how Assyrian kings might have hesitated before going through this ceremony. The earlier Assyrian king Sennacherib would simply have been lying if he swore this oath. He hand-smashed the walls of Babylon. And Assyrian kings weren't in the habit of being dragged by their ears by their priests. This private ritual continued. The priest gave a speech in which he asked Marduk to bless the king and destroy his enemies. And the king got back his scepter, circle, and sword. But he wasn't done with being abused. The priest had to hit him in the face again, really hard this time. The text says, "If when he strikes the king's cheek the tears flow, it means that the god Bel is friendly. If no tears appear, the god Bel is angry, the enemy will rise up and bring about his downfall." The king himself was an omen at this point. The king had better hoped that he cried. The moment when the king literally took the hand of Marduk came after this, on the 8th day of the festival. This is when the public part of the proceedings started. The statue of Marduk was brought out of the temple, and the king took his hand. Somehow, the god spoke and announced his plans for the year. Now, obviously, statues don't speak, so it's unclear what this really meant. This was followed by a huge procession. At the front, Marduk and the king rode in a chariot, followed by other gods, along with musicians, singers, dancers, priests, officials, and royal family members. Usually, the gods were hidden away in the secret holy places in temples, but not now. The Babylonian population got a chance to actually see their gods. It was a time for celebration, and people lined the streets. They knew that the secret rites must have taken place, and a new good year lay ahead. Marduk and the other gods were all taken by boat to a special Akitu temple outside the city. There they were placed together in a room to meet, like some sort of divine G7 meeting. Some of the gods had traveled to Babylon from other cities. Their presence confirmed that Babylon was the greatest city, and Marduk was the greatest god. A day later, the procession came back to Babylon. Marduk made another speech. However, he did that, and returned to his temple, and the other gods went home. The world was safe. But when the statue of Marduk was in Assyria, after Sennacherib's conquest of Babylon, none of this could happen. That must have been disorienting for the people. Maybe it terrified them. What awful things would take place if the Akitu festival was cancelled? Fortunately, the statue of Marduk was returned to Babylon in the reign of the Neo-Assyrian ruler Ashurbanipal during the 7th century BCE, and the Akitu festival resumed. 50 years after that, when the Assyrian Empire fell in 612 BCE, the Babylonians credited Marduk with their success. The Babylonian king Nabopolassar was on the throne at the time. He had a son named Nebuchadnezzar, who was a very successful general during the war against Assyria. When Nabopolassar died in 605, Nebuchadnezzar II took over the Babylonian throne. He enjoyed a long reign of 43 years and was responsible for many of Babylon's subsequent successes. Nebuchadnezzar continued to fight through most of his reign. A lot of regions of what had been the Neo-Assyrian Empire resisted being absorbed into the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Some of them, especially in the west, allied themselves with Egypt. The kingdom of Judah in the Levant was one of these. We know about this because the authors of the Bible wrote about it in detail. The kings of Judah stopped paying their tribute to Babylon. But Egypt didn't end up helping them. The Babylonian army showed up in Judah in response to a rebellion, and in 587 BCE, Judah was conquered. Vast numbers of Jews were now taken captive to Babylon. The Babylonians put a king on the throne in Judah who was supposed to be loyal to them, but he rebelled as well. The Babylonians came back and besieged Jerusalem. More people were deported. Obviously, Nebuchadnezzar used the same kinds of strategies that the Assyrians had used before him. But unlike the Assyrian kings, Nebuchadnezzar didn't brag about his conquests in his royal inscriptions. Mostly, he bragged about his building activities. Nebuchadnezzar wanted Babylon to be extraordinary. If there was some way for us to see the city the way it looked during his reign, I think we'd find it dazzling. The Greek historian Herodotus claimed to have visited Babylon. and he wrote that there is no other city that approaches to it. That's high praise from someone who was familiar with Athens and who had visited Egypt as well. But we don't know if Herodotus actually went to Babylon, or if he described what other people had told him. He was way off on the size of the city. It was huge, but not even close to being as huge as he said. Herodotus said it was square, with each of the 4 sides of the city wall being 14 miles long. This would have been a total of 56 miles of city walls. In reality, the whole wall that surrounded the city was only about 10 miles long. Still, Babylon was bigger than Nineveh had been, and it was the biggest city that had ever existed in that region up to that time. It continued to be the biggest until Rome, centuries later. So it's unclear why Herodotus felt the need to exaggerate. But Herodotus liked to exaggerate. He might have been the father of history, but he didn't have any real concern about getting his numbers correct. Still, Herodotus did get a lot of things right about Babylon, as confirmed when archaeologists excavated the city. For now, let's say that Herodotus's description of Babylon was pretty accurate, except for the statistics. Combined with what archaeologists found, it gives us a sense of the grandeur of Nebuchadnezzar's building program. So, imagine you could take a tour of ancient Babylon. The obvious place to start is the Temple of Marduk. The whole temple complex was as big as 2 football fields, and was near the river that flowed through the middle of the city. There were 2 courtyards. In one was the ziggurat, and in the other was the lower temple. The ziggurat would have been visible for miles around. It was a giant stepped tower with a shrine on the top, and it seems to have been 7 levels high in Nebuchadnezzar's time. Ziggurats were made of solid brick, with an exterior stairway. The only room in it was at the top. Some ziggurats were painted in different colors, 1 color per level, but that probably wasn't true in Babylon. Anyway, Herodotus doesn't mention it. But the very top level was probably a bright blue, faced with glazed bricks. Herodotus says that the shrine on the top had a couch in it for the god to rest in. Some modern scholars think they might have been divine statues up there. We just don't know. The main statues of Marduk and Sarpanatum were in the lower temple called the Esangil. That's where the private ceremonies of the Akitu festival took place. The statues might have been made of solid gold. That's what Herodotus thought anyway. He said that the Marduk statue also had a gold table and a gold throne, and according to what he'd been told, these objects weighed a total of 800 talents. That's 22 tons of gold. Some scholars think that the statues might actually have been made of wood with gold plating. Either way, they were certainly spectacular. The statue's eyes and hair would have been inlaid with other materials like shell, lapis lazuli, and carnelian, and they wore clothes that were finely woven and embroidered. Walking north from the Esangil, you'd be on the processional way, the same road that the gods took during the Akitu festival parade. It was wide, and the walls on both sides were tiled with glazed bricks in bands of bright blue and yellow with white rosettes. A wide middle band of turquoise bricks provided the background for images of striding, growling lions, colored white and brown and black. These lions were actually carved in relief. Each brick was created with part of the scene on it, molded before the bricks were baked. Then the bricks were put together like a giant jigsaw puzzle. Because the colorful glaze was fired in the kiln, the colors haven't faded much, even today. At the end of the processional way stood a kind of vision, the Ishtar Gate. This whole tall gateway was deep blue, with borders in white and yellow, and relief sculptures of bulls and dragons arranged in rows. It was entirely covered in glazed bricks, so it shone in the sun like a giant jewel. When German archaeologists excavated in Babylon during the early 20th century, they dismantled the Ishtar Gate, packed it up to take with them to Berlin. It was meticulously reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum. The gate is 50 feet high, and the original foundations extended another 45 feet underground. Now, back on our tour of Babylon, just before you pass through the Ishtar Gate, off to the left, was one wall of Nebuchadnezzar's palace. The palace was the size of many city blocks, built around 5 huge courtyards and surrounded with thick fortification walls. The layout looks a lot like the palaces of the Assyrian kings, like a labyrinth in a way, with vast numbers of offices, workshops, storage rooms, kitchens, domestic apartments, and so on. But it would have been a different experience to visit. Take the throne room. Although the walls were brightly colored, they weren't decorated with battle scenes. The same type of glazed brick reliefs that decorated the processional way and the Ishtar Gate were used in the palace as well. They featured stylized palm trees, rosettes, palmettes, naturalistic lions, and other motifs from nature. Even the cuneiform inscriptions on the walls were carved onto glazed bricks and pieced together in the right places by the builders. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't seem to have been interested in being surrounded by sculptures of himself. Presumably, he looked like other Assyrian and Babylonian kings with a long beard and elaborate robes. But statues of him haven't been found. So it seems that the Babylonian kings adopted a lot of strategies from Assyria. Things like frequent military campaigns, sieges of enemy cities, deportations of rebellious populations, and so on. But unlike the Assyrians, they didn't brag about these tactics in inscriptions or depict them in relief sculptures. They were, however, very interested in the past. A lot of their art seems to have been drawn from very ancient Babylonian models. In big public inscriptions, they even used a style of cuneiform from Hammurabi's era more than 1,000 years earlier. It was very different from the script that they used every day for practical purposes. Imagine if a text today were written in a script from the medieval period. That's the equivalent. After centuries of fighting Assyrian control, the Babylonians seem to have had no interest in emulating Assyrian culture outside the military. In fact, there's remarkably little evidence for any Assyrian influence, even though the Assyrians were strongly influenced by Babylon. Instead, the Babylonian kings were making the point that they were the inheritors of a very ancient tradition and culture, one that had been started by the Akkads themselves when they created Babylon. As Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt Babylon, he even made a point of restoring buildings from centuries before rather than knocking them down. Some scholars have called these Neo-Babylonian kings the sponsors of the world's first archaeology. When they found sculptures and objects from the past as they dug, they treated them carefully and put them in their palaces. In classical times, Babylon was best known for its city wall, which was listed in one version of the ancient 7 Wonders of the World. This was another of Nebuchadnezzar II's achievements. The main wall was so wide that you could ride a chariot along the top. And in most parts of the city, 3 lines of these walls ran parallel to one another, along with a moat on the outside. The river Euphrates flowed right through the center of the city, with the 2 halves connected by a wooden bridge on top of stone piers. That was quite an engineering feat. So, what was it like to live in this incredible city? People must have felt that they were living in the most modern, most extraordinary place. Even though individual houses and the lives of average citizens were much the same as they had always been, the city as a whole was on a scale unlike any other. People from all over the world, or at least the world they knew, lived there. Many of them had been deported from other parts of the empire, but most of them weren't slaves, and the records show that many of them thrived. Some documents found in Mesopotamian cities include Jewish names. These confirm that Jews from Judah were living there in exile, as the Bible said. There are even cuneiform records of the Judean king and his sons receiving plenty of rations from the Babylonian administration. So, Babylon was the center of the world in the view of the people who lived there, and it was home to many ideas. But it was also a place where people were deeply proud of their traditions. Today, it's hard for us to grasp this, but the Babylonians had no way of knowing that thousands of years of history and technological progress lay ahead for humankind. They didn't think of themselves as living in the ancient world. They looked back to their distant past for inspiration in art and architecture and tradition. To them, that was the ancient world. But they saw themselves as modern, living, as we all do, right in the present, right at the very most recent moment that has ever existed. In 562 BCE, one of the great Mesopotamian kings died. This was Nebuchadnezzar II, and he'd ruled over an era of almost unprecedented wealth, a time when all of Mesopotamia and much of the rest of the Near East have been united within the Neo-Babylonian Empire, partly because of conquest, partly because of trade, and partly because of immigration. Many populations were on the move during his reign. The contacts between people had a profound effect on the history of this region. One influential group was the Arameans. They spoke a Semitic language called Aramaic, and they'd been growing in influence for several centuries. In fact, the Aramaic language had gradually replaced Akkadian and other languages across north and northwestern Mesopotamia. And Aramaic would continue to be a major language in the Near East for hundreds of years. Another group of people, known as the Medes, had burst onto the scene toward the end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and they'd helped to bring that empire to an end with their fierce attacks on the city of Nineveh in 612 BCE. The Medes were based in what is now northwestern Iran and had been there for at least 2 centuries, but only recently they had started asserting themselves militarily. Still another group of people, the Persians, lived further south on the Iranian plateau. For now, they were subject to the Medes. The Medes and the Persians spoke Indo-European languages and had different religious beliefs from their neighbors in Mesopotamia and Elam in what is now southwest Iran. Then there were Jews living in Babylon as well. They were there because of the deportations that the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II had imposed when the Hebrew state of Judah was conquered in 587 BCE. So Babylon, as the biggest city in the whole Near East, was home to members of all these different groups. There were native Babylonians, along with Arameans, Elamites, Assyrians who'd moved there during the time of the empire or fled there afterwards, Jews, Medes, Persians, and many others as well. This larger era in which these contacts were taking place is sometimes known as the Axial Age. It started in the 8th century and lasted until around 200 BCE. This wasn't just in the Near East, mind you, it was a phenomenon that reached all across Eurasia. A lot of new ideas were spreading, as though society had reached a collective turning point. Some philosophers and prophets stopped thinking only about local, pragmatic issues and started wondering about more abstract things. They asked questions like, what constitutes good government? How can people be virtuous? What is the meaning of life? These questions were answered by new religious ideas in some places and by new philosophies elsewhere. It's unclear how much the various thinkers were influenced by one another, but in cities like Babylon, a lot of the new ideas would have been shared between people from different places. One of the earliest of the innovative thinkers was a Persian prophet named Zarathustra, also known as Zoroaster. No one's sure exactly when he lived, but his ideas were increasingly popular around the time of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. His followers are known as Zoroastrians. Zarathustra was believed to have had a revelation, a message directly from a god. He taught that all of human experience can be seen as a battle between good and evil. He taught there is a god of good and a god of evil, and it's up to humans to choose to do good. Eventually, this cosmic battle will result in the victory of good over evil. Zoroastrians believed that all the good gods in every civilization were incarnations of Ahura Mazda, their great god of goodness. So anyone worshipping any god was, in a way, worshipping Ahura Mazda. This was also the time when the Jewish religion became more universal, with the monotheistic belief that there is just one God, and that he is the only God of all people. The prophet who wrote in the biblical book of Isaiah around this time mocked the Mesopotamians for worshipping gods in the form of wooden statues. He wrote that such a man takes a piece of wood. One half of the wood he burns in his fire, and on this he roasts meat. Then what is left of the wood he makes into a god, an image to which he bows down and prostrates himself. He prays to it and says, "Save me, for you are my God." To the Jews, their God was all-knowing and all-powerful, and the gods of other cultures were false. Beyond the Near East, all kinds of ideas were developing, like Confucianism and Taoism in China, classical Hinduism and Jainism in India, philosophy in Greece. These thinkers were all asking similar questions, but coming up with different answers. Even the ancient polytheistic religion of the Mesopotamians was beginning to develop some new ideas. Toward the end of the Neo-Assyrian period, around the 7th century BCE, there had been some syncretism going on. Some texts mention the idea that perhaps two or more gods were actually the same god under different names. Of course, they had always concluded that if, for example, there were moon gods in two societies, then it was the same god with two different names. But some Assyrians were starting to think that perhaps their chief god Ashur might be the same as, say, the moon god. This is sometimes called incipient monotheism. Some people were starting to think that there might be something bigger than the individual gods. In this era, then, the Babylonian belief that their god Marduk was the king of all the gods might have been shakier than it seemed on the surface. Certainly the Jews in Babylon wouldn't have agreed, nor would the Assyrians, who were still devoted to Ashur, nor would any Persian or Mede who had settled in the capital city. And across the Neo-Babylonian Empire, where beliefs varied a lot, devotion to Marduk would have been still less fervent. Into this vibrant, multi-ethnic, multi-religious environment came a king who had some new, radical religious ideas. His name was Nabonidus, and he wasn't related to the Babylonian kings who came before him. One of those predecessors, Nebuchadnezzar II, had overseen a stable reign, but his son and successor was deposed after just 2 years. After 2 more very short reigns, Nabonidus then took over. He was an unlikely king. Not only was he not a member of the royal family, but he may have owed his position to his remarkable mother. Her name was Adad-Gupi, and she wrote an autobiography. It wasn't a long autobiography, not like one someone might write today. It's just about 2 pages long when transcribed, and she probably had quite a bit of help from her son in composing it. After all, it finishes after her death, and it helps make the case for Nabonidus' right to be king. But the facts it relates are probably mostly true. Adad-Gupi had been born around 649 BCE during the reign of Ashurbanipal of Assyria, and she lived to the age of 104, long enough to see her son rule Babylonia. Through her whole life, she was totally devoted to the moon god Sin. Adad-Gupi grew up in the Syrian city of Haran, which was one of the homes to the moon god. The city of Haran had been controlled by the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and it was there that the last Neo-Assyrian ruler fled after Nineveh was conquered in 612 BCE. 3 years later, Haran was conquered by the Babylonians. At that point, Adad-Gupi was 40 years old. Nabonidus would have been just a child at this time. Both he and his mother were heartbroken by the destruction in their home city. Even the temple of their beloved god was ruined. They moved to Babylon after this, and Nabonidus eventually got a position in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar II. Time passed. Decades, actually. Adad-Gupi was around 87 years old when Nebuchadnezzar died. At some point, Adad-Gupi had a dream that her son Nabonidus would restore the temple of Sin in Haran. And Nabonidus himself had a similar dream. It's recorded in a surviving inscription. Up until now, he said that he didn't have any thoughts of becoming king. But then the moon god appeared to him in a dream. Sin told him that he should rebuild the temple in Haran, and then he would become king. Dreams were taken really seriously in ancient Mesopotamia. If a god appeared, then it meant that god was giving you a message. You couldn't ignore it. So, when all the chaos erupted after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, perhaps Nabonidus thought that Sin wanted him to become king and restore order. He managed to take the throne in 556 BCE and seems to have been determined to follow through with his commitment to the moon god, who in his mind had given him the throne. He dutifully had the temple in Haran reconstructed, and he commissioned a new statue of the god, since the old one seems to have been destroyed. Now, here's where we run into problems of interpretation. Quite a few sources survive about Nabonidus, and they give us very different impressions of him. Some were written by people who despised him. Some were written by people who benefited from making him look bad. Some he wrote himself. He was even written about by much later Greek historians, and was probably discussed in the book of Daniel in the Bible. But in Daniel, the actions of Nabonidus were attributed to Nebuchadnezzar. So, what really happened, and why? Well, Nabonidus started out his reign venerating all the Mesopotamian gods. He went through with the New Year's festival, the Akitu festival, in Babylon. He swore to the Babylonian god Marduk that he would support him. But in his second year, he seems to have proposed a religious transformation, with the moon god Sin being raised to a higher position than Marduk. He wrote at the time that the administrators and people of the cult centers offended his great godhead, that is the moon god. They acted wickedly, they sinned, not knowing the great wrath of Nana, that's another name for the moon god, the king of the gods. They forgot his rights and gnawed each other like dogs. So now, to Nabonidus, Sin was the king of the gods, and the people had neglected him. The worshippers and priests of Marduk weren't happy about this. No previous Babylonian king had blatantly preferred another god to Marduk. In his second year, Nabonidus had made his son Belshazzar co-regent with him. Soon after this, Nabonidus went off on a campaign to the west, and he didn't come back for 10 years. He settled in a city called Tema in northern Arabia. His son Belshazzar was in power in Babylon, but Belshazzar couldn't stand in for Nabonidus in the New Year's festival. All the sources are in agreement that the New Year's festival, the Akitu, didn't happen for a whole decade. This was a really weird thing for a Babylonian king to do. Lots of possible explanations have been proposed. One is based on the evidence of an anti-Nabonidus rant that was written shortly after his reign by angry enemies, possibly the priests of Marduk. Of course, they would have been furious about the cancellation of the Akitu festival. This source certainly makes it sound as though Nabonidus was determined to make Sin the chief god in place of Marduk. If that had been true, you can see why he wouldn't have been keen to go through with the Akitu festival. He still believed in Marduk, of course, and would have known that swearing a false oath to Marduk was asking for trouble. So, maybe Tema, where he went into exile, was just a convenient place to live that was not Babylon. It didn't hurt that it was another center for the worship of the moon god. But in his inscriptions, Nabonidus seemed to still venerate the other gods, so he might not have been quite as heretical in his stance toward Marduk as his opponents suggested. If true, perhaps he moved to Tamar because it was strategically important to the empire. It was on a number of trade routes, and Nabonidus sponsored the construction of some buildings there. Later Greek and Roman writers, and the author of the Book of Daniel, portrayed Nabonidus as insane, but people who wrote in his own time didn't mention this, so it probably wasn't true. There must have been a reason for his absence from Babylon, but scholars disagree about what it was. It seems that Nabonidus did think that Sin was a more powerful god than Marduk. He apparently proposed that the temple to Marduk in Babylon should be rededicated to the moon god. And he had an explanation. There was a crescent-shaped symbol in the temple that he believed seemed more appropriate to the moon god than to Marduk. But of course no Babylonian would have approved of that. A scholar named Paul-Alain Beaulieu at the University of Toronto has suggested that what Nabonidus was trying to do was not simply to usurp Marduk, but rather to develop a new theology. These new ideas would be more appropriate to an extensive empire made up of people with many different religious beliefs. Nabonidus might have been trying to convince people that several gods could be worshipped as the same god. Perhaps Sin and Marduk were the same. He wasn't necessarily trying just to impose the moon god on the people as a replacement for Marduk. Whatever his ambitions were, they didn't work. The priests of Marduk were incensed. They would have devoutly believed that the continued functioning of the whole universe depended on Marduk's veneration and on the restoration of the Akitu festival. They would have wanted Nabonidus out of power. And then the outside world intervened. While Nabonidus lived in exile from 553 to 543 BCE, a king named Cyrus was busily changing the political face of the Near East. He took the throne in Persia in 559, before Nabonidus was even king. Cyrus at that time was co-regent with his father, and Persia was a small kingdom under the control of the Medes. But after 8 years, his father died, and Cyrus became the sole king of Persia. Right away, he rebelled against his overlord. He was able to conquer the army of the Medes in 550. Still, Nabonidus was away in Tamar, and the overthrow of the king of the Medes probably didn't make a big impression on him. But Cyrus kept going. He turned his attention to the kingdom of Lydia in what is now Turkey, and he attacked. Cyrus was victorious there as well, and by 546 BCE he had taken control of the Lydian capital of Sardis. Cyrus now moved his troops back towards the Persian heartland. At this point, Nabonidus may have started to get nervous. Persian Empire was expanding, and Cyrus was repeatedly victorious. Finally, Nabonidus returned from Tamar to Babylon during his 13th year on the throne. Right away, he removed many high officials from their positions, and he replaced them. They probably had disapproved of his religious reforms. In 540 BCE, Cyrus attacked Persia's western neighbor, Elam. The Persian Empire was getting dangerously close to Babylon. The Elamite capital of Susa was only 160 miles east of the Tigris River. The Elamites had a long and rich history as a power in the region. Sometimes they'd been subject to Mesopotamian kingdoms, but mostly they'd been independent, and often a thorn in the side of Mesopotamian kings. A century before this, in 647 BCE, the army of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal had attacked Elam and sacked Susa. But the Assyrians hadn't been able to hold on to Elam for long. Hearing that Elam was under attack by the Persians seems to have worried Nabonidus. He called for all Mesopotamian city gods to be brought into Babylon. He might have done this to protect them, or perhaps he wanted their help in protecting his city. Either way, the absence of the divine statues left the people in their cities feeling as though they'd been abandoned. It doesn't seem to have made Nabonidus any more popular. Now that Elam was brought under Persian control, Cyrus's next obvious target was Babylonia. Would the Babylonians fight fiercely to defend their land? Did they? It depends on which account you read. There was a battle between the Babylonians and the Persians at the site of Opis, north of Babylon, and the Persians won. After that, though, according to some accounts, the Babylonians don't seem to have tried very hard to keep the Persians out. In 539 BCE, Cyrus took Babylon. According to his own account, he did it without a fight. Not just that, the people of Babylon welcomed him. In his words, they bowed to him and kissed his feet. Soon after this, Cyrus had a royal inscription drawn up and distributed to describe his Babylonian conquest. The most famous version of it was in the form of a clay cylinder buried in the ground as a foundation deposit. It's been called the Cyrus cylinder ever since it was discovered. Archaeologists have found other versions of the same text on tablets, which suggests that it was sent out as a sort of ancient press release. It's a fascinating text. It's written in cuneiform, using the Akkadian language, which of course wasn't Cyrus's native tongue. It's also full of typical things that you'd expect a Mesopotamian king to say. Cyrus calls himself King of the world, Great King, Mighty King, King of Babylon, King of Sumer and Akkad, King of the Four Quarters. These are classic Mesopotamian titles, not Persian ones. Only after listing those does he add that he's also King of Ansham, that is Persia, and then he gives the names of his father, grandfather, and his ancestors. But he adds that his kingship was desired by Bel, which meant Lord and was used to refer to Marduk. So he really presents himself as a legitimate Mesopotamian king. More than that, he says that Marduk sought him out and wanted him to rule in Babylon, because the previous king, which would be Nabonidus of course, had neglected his religious duties. He's pretty tough on Nabonidus. He writes that an incompetent person was installed to exercise lordship over his country. Irreverently, he put an end to the regular offerings. By his own plan, he did away with the worship of Marduk, the king of the gods. He continually did evil against Marduk's city. You can see how Cyrus made good use here of the unpopularity of Nabonidus. He describes things getting worse before he arrived. The gods being sent to Babylon, for example, and Nabonidus requiring a lot of forced labor. Then he says that Marduk surveyed and looked throughout all the lands, searching for a righteous king whom he would support. He called out his name, Cyrus, king of Anshan. According to this account, Cyrus took over control in Babylon because Marduk had asked him to. That is, Marduk chose Cyrus to rescue the Babylonians from the heresies of Nabonidus. He even said that Marduk marched at his side and, quote, delivered Nabonidus, the king who did not revere him, into his hands. And the people of Babylon rejoiced at Cyrus's kingship, and their faces shone. They greeted him with gladness and praised his name. At that point, Cyrus released the people from the kind of forced labor they had had to do for Nabonidus, and let their gods go back to their cities. How, obviously, this is propaganda. It's what he wanted people to believe about him. We can't be sure at all how happy the people of Babylon were that Cyrus liberated them from the rule of Nabonidus. Still, he was wise to use their language for his inscription, and to use phrases that were familiar from previous Mesopotamian inscriptions. Cyrus was also wise to declare himself completely devoted to Marduk, even though Marduk wasn't a Persian god, of course. Cyrus was good to other people who lived in Babylon as well. The Bible records that the Jews living in exile were allowed to return to Jerusalem after Cyrus took power. Right from the start, Cyrus created his empire in a different way from the kings who came before him. He hadn't depended on creating fear in the population. He seems to have wanted to be loved. When he'd conquered the Medes 12 years earlier, he let the king live, and he even married the Median king's daughter. It was as though he was joining the Medes rather than oppressing them. His inscription has been described as the earliest expression of a king consciously attempting to rule a society of different nationalities and different faiths. In terms of the Babylonians, he made it clear that he understood their frustrations with Nabonidus, and that he could solve the problem. Marduk would be happy again. The order of the universe would be restored. And Babylon did continue to be a stable and prosperous place. Plenty of documents survive from the period of Persian rule, showing that life went on pretty much as before. Only gradually did the Mesopotamian gods begin to fall out of favor. The cuneiform writing system was used less and less. New cities replaced some of the old Mesopotamian capitals. The Persian kings stopped coming to Babylon for the New Year's festival, and Babylon became one of many provincial cities paying tribute to the great Persian kings, who lived far away, ruling over the biggest empire the world had ever seen to that point. It extended all the way from the Indus River Valley to the Aegean Sea. Mesopotamian culture had lasted for more than 3,000 years, but by around the year 1, it was gone. It wasn't until cuneiform was deciphered in the 19th century that the amazing ancient history of Mesopotamia began to be rediscovered. Even so, the Mesopotamians left an incredible legacy to the world. They invented the very idea of writing. They built the world's first cities and figured out how people could live together by the thousands in relative peace and civility. They wrote down the earliest laws and created a judicial system that prized evidence and fairness, a system that still influences us today. They created mechanisms of diplomacy that never stopped being used. They studied the stars. They figured out how to calculate the dates of eclipses, and they anticipated the movements of the planets. Many achievements credited to the Greeks had their origins long before in Mesopotamia, like the calculation of the sides of a right-angled triangle, or the innovation of the phalanx formation in battle, or the names of the constellations. One Mesopotamian innovation has an impact on our lives every single day. You see, Mesopotamian mathematics was based on the number 60. For example, their system of weights and measures had 60 shekels in a mina, which weighed about a pound, and 60 minas in a talent. This was convenient, because 60 divides up easily into lots of different fractions. If you have 60 of something, then half that amount, or a third, or a quarter, or a fifth, or a sixth, those are all whole numbers. Having 10 as the basis of your number system is trickier. Calculating half of 10 is easy, but a third of 10, a fourth of 10, a sixth of 10, none of those are whole numbers. And we still have a few vestiges of that 60-based system. After all, we have 360 degrees in a circle, and 60 seconds in a minute, and 60 minutes in an hour. Thanks to the Mesopotamians for those. One thing that inspires me about the Mesopotamians is that they were so smart and thoughtful. My students, before taking my classes, often assume that the people of the ancient world were brutal and vicious, that they wouldn't have known how to be civilized. But that's not true at all. The Mesopotamians always tried to make things rational and fair in their culture and in their society. Like the tavern keeper, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, written in the 19th century BCE, the Mesopotamians remind us to enjoy life. But you, Gilgamesh, let your belly be full. Enjoy yourself always, by day and by night. Make merry each day. Dance and play day and night. Let your clothes be clean. Let your head be washed. May you bathe in water. Gaze on the child who holds your hand. Let your wife enjoy your repeated embrace, for such is the destiny of mortal men. I want to thank you for joining me in this exploration of ancient Mesopotamian history and culture. The contemporary world shares a great deal with the Mesopotamians, and this is because they created many institutions that still exist today. We live in cities. We resolve conflicts in courts of law. We pay taxes. We tell stories. We write letters to faraway family members and friends. We pray, we sing, we get married, just as they did. On the other hand, our modern explanations of the things we see around us differ radically from theirs, as do many of our responses to human and natural events. We don't think the way they did, not at all. But the Mesopotamians had a rich experience of life, and the hundreds of thousands of documents that have survived since the Mesopotamians' time allow us a window into their world. In the future, as more documents are found and translated, we will continue to learn more and to develop an even deeper understanding of the men and women who first tackled the dilemmas of urban life.